Alright, so I have been grinding out some Vampire Coast games, and I have a fun set of builds to begin showing. So for this match, it's going to be my new coast build against the Lizardmen, and this time I've actually gone for a Siren Rush. That's right, the age of the Vampire Coast guns sadly is over, and now it seems like the best strategies are either rushes or kite builds. So here we go. The match is between myself and a fellow clanmate, Saphir, and this is actually the second of two Lizardmen builds that he brought against me. For this one, he is going to be bringing in a pretty heavy Saurus Warrior Rush, actually a very elite front line, with a Skink Priest of Beasts 2 coming in with no Manticore summon, which actually would have been really good against a gun build. But in this case, Manticore is actually not that useful. With the ROR Rotting Prometheans, I'm actually feeling fairly safe. Now, at the beginning of the game, the Sirens are positioning to fight Saurus Warriors. They have a really nice matchup against them, and I mostly want to be dodging spells. I also need to be scab-scrathing these chameleon skinks, or the skink cohort that is, just because scab-scrath will annihilate them very quickly, and it's a bit of a misplay that my scab-scrath comes in so late. Now the general strategy that I'm planning to play out here is dodging spells with my Sirens, which I did fail here, although they do live, and also using as many Neheks as possible on said Sirens, using actually a lot fewer zombie summons that I would usually go for, because just the Sirens are so important here for actually winning. The Lizardmen really only have Wind Blast as their main magic damage spell, and by healing up the Sirens, they should be able to carry me in this match. Now, early on, these feral cold ones meant to take out guns actually don't have too many targets here, and I can ward them off pretty easily with a backline of two Sirens. Meanwhile, my Sirens fighting Saurus Warriors will be able to grind out for a really long time, and as you can see here on the left flank, as my Sirens get low, I pull them away from the fight so that I can heal them up more efficiently. And what I'm actually planning at this point is to group up this unit of Sirens and this other damage unit and this one on the far side, so that I can get a nice and efficient Nahek. Now, Oxyotl is in the battle too. He will be consistently sniping my crabs, but honestly, Lizardmen usually don't have that much to counter two Gunnery Wights and a Lamprey's Revenge. Oxyotl, he might be able to help kill off the Gunnery Wights in a long game, but at this point I just have a few too many forces and too many armor targets to take down. The Sirens are doing great against Saurus Warriors, same with my zombie bombers, and that's all I really need to do well in the front line here. Since the rest are just skink cohort with javelins, they actually don't fare very well, and the fact that the Saurus Warriors do lose to the ROR Rotting Prometheans is just amazing for me. Now, at some point I will want to shut down Oxyotl with Sirens, but at the moment I'm still trying to group up these three Sirens, and I do eventually get that Nahek down. Flock of Doom will mitigate some of that value, but all in all I'm still getting way more value than that Flock of Doom. Meanwhile, Noctilus and my Gunnery Wight squad are extremely healthy at this point. There's actually not much outside of Oxyotl that can take them down. The Feral Bastillodon to just wet noodle against these ethereal units. And at this point, the balance of power is very much in my favor. And honestly, this build, it just feels amazing to use against people that expect a more gun-heavy style of play. Of course, Lizardmen do have Temple Guard, but against Vampire Coast, they are very rarely brought. Now, another Nahek getting cast on my Sirens here. Like I said earlier, you basically want to heal cap them. I've used no zombie summons this entire game, except for the Moondial summons for Count Noctilus. The main goal here is just to make sure that my Gunnery Wights are nice and supported, and if anything feels dicey, I can always bring in my Rotting Prometheans to support them. In general, this build is actually fairly easy to pilot, and most of my micro goes into the Sirens to make sure that they don't take too many spells, spreading them out nice and evenly. And then I'm more or less fine. If the Gunnery Wights take damage, they will get an Invocation of Nahek, and the more units I can catch in an overcast, the more value. At this point, the balance of power is extremely in my favor, and Saphir, sadly, just did not have too much to actually beat the build. A very decisive victory, and I'm actually quite happy with this one. You see the Bombers doing great, and the Sirens about paying for themselves, except for one. They all survived till the late game though, and they had a ton of HP to keep fighting if needed. Even against 7 Saurus warriors, they all got cleared out fairly easily, and I'll probably be running this build more in the future. And now for actually a bonus game showing that this build does indeed work against different Lizardmen playstyles. This time, Saphir has brought Chameleon Stalkers against the build Oxyotl and a Skink Oracle, which is actually quite scary against my Gunnery Wights. This is actually a less optimized version of the build using Warngulls, but I would definitely sub these guys out for 2 units of Sirens and a zombie, basically copying the build from the first game. Windblast does drop, hits some of my Sirens, but unless they're actually clumped up onto a unit, you can see Windblast barely do any damage actually. All the Sirens survive, and an Invocation of Nahek would easily bring these guys back up. Now, much more scary this time around, 2 Stegodons are constantly firing in on my crabs, and this build is actually one of the worst case scenarios you can run into. With the Skink Oracle's insane damage output, you can see those ROR Prometheans are having a very hard time. But the Mourngulls, they still do exceptionally well versus any unit of Skinks really, and I can actually leave them in the fight for quite a while. My Sirens are playing extremely aggressively too, and the play is to keep them away from the Skink Priests of Heavens. You can see any units that do get close, a big Wind Blast can take out about 200 gold value quite easily, and you'll have to negate that with an Invocation of Nahek. Now, to deal with the Skink Oracle, I've actually positioned my Gunnery Wights in the back so that they can shoot at it from a far distance. Now, the 2 Stegodons will be able to poke away at them, but the Gunnery Wights themselves, actually a similar price as the Skink Oracle, also happen to have 2 shots. So I think fair is fair in this situation, as my Gunnery Wights actually do push the Oracle back. And my front line is doing rather well. That's because all the front line for the Lizardmen here are just Chameleon Skinks or Skink Cohort, and they just do not trade well against the might of the Vampire Coast Rush. Skink Oracle still getting extremely beat up at this point. He is casting some fireballs at my Gunnery Wight, so they are starting to get pretty low. In this situation, I think it would have been good to heal them up actually, but putting my heals on Sirens, definitely not a terrible choice. I've split off Noctilus and my Lamprey's Revenge too to shut down the Stegodon, as these guys should be able to do very well in melee. And now my Sirens are going to be screening this Skink Oracle away, allowing my Gunnery Wights to push further forwards. Now, again in this game, I've also forgotten to use my Scab's Grass. Probably a pretty big misplay, but it doesn't really matter. Even forgetting the Scab's Grass, I still managed to win this front line quite decisively. But these single entities, we'll see if I'm able to defeat them. I do finally remember the Scab's Grass now though. I get some light amount of damage on the Skink Cohort, but that's not really very important here. Now the Sirens are targeted just to chase the Skink Oracle, but because this unit is as fast as a Carnosaur, it actually is a bit of a misplay. These Sirens should be trying to cut off its path simply by moving in this direction, but in just flatly chasing it, it does manage to escape, and that will actually cause problems later on. Meanwhile, in the center, my Gunnery Wights can finally get on top of this Stegodon, while my ROR Prometheans do actually get shut down, trying to pin down the Stegodon on the left flank. And one actual terrible situation now. The Skink Oracle can fire in on my Gunnery Wights. Thankfully, the Bombers do actually manage to stagger it somehow, and that saves me quite a bit of damage that could have gone onto my gunnery whites. But still pretty sketchy, especially since this one white is getting focused. I throw down a Nahek on top of it, but he will be dying in just a second. I split off a second gunnery white to chase off the Skink Oracle, and I probably should have done that with both gunnery whites, since this is obviously a very high priority target because of his insane DPS. But the Lizardmen frontline at the very least is gone. I've lost both of my Mourngulls, which is why I recommend you take Sirens instead. They're just a much better unit, and Oxyotl has been quite uncontested for this entire game. Definitely not the best situation. You really want him down if you have a low HP Noctilus or a low HP Gunnery White, but I do still feel fairly safe since both of them are indeed at half HP. Now all of these skink units, they are low enough on HP where I am not worried about them at all. The Sirens with their terror will easily rout them off the battlefield. The Gunnery White is quite low though, and the Skink Oracle does manage to come up again to get a shot off on the White, getting in a really nice amount of damage. Second shot comes in, hits the Gunnery White, and now he's extremely low. Stegodon thankfully misses, but the Gunnery White, his TPS, it's not gonna be enough to actually snipe out the Skink Oracle here. Having the Sirens to support is definitely going to be good, but it's a little bit sketchy. A nice target fire does take out the Gunnery White too. And now I'm actually a little bit afraid here. I do know that the Winds of Magic are quite low for my opponent because he's been spamming Wind Blasts, Saphir. He's also been spamming Earthbloods with the Skink Oracle. So I know if I can keep my Sirens alive, I should be okay. And finally, I get my Sirens down on Oxyotl, getting in some nice chip damage on him and making sure that it's much harder for him to shoot. Now, as I say that, he does fire a shot at Noctilus. A lot of these units can shoot in combat if you micro them correctly, so it's always important to keep that in mind. Noctilus, though, with his heals, he won't be dying anytime soon. He's actually a fairly tanky target, so I'm not too worried. The ROR Prometheans, too, have been just a big pain for the Lizardmen. They've been able to survive most of the game with their regeneration, and I would definitely recommend taking this unit. They generally grind out very long into the late game, and that allows their regeneration to do well quite consistently. Now Oxyotl, he's still getting chased off. This Skink Oracle, though, just the constant pain is his high maneuverability, just avoiding these Sirens for the entire battle. Now shooting at Noctilus, getting in decent damage, but I think one of the shots actually gets blocked by a tree, thankfully, and Noctilus does survive. This does show the importance of actually sniping out this Skink Oracle too. I think had I played this match again, my Gunnery Whites would have focused him down a lot more aggressively. He shoots a fireball too at my Sirens, getting in a decent amount of damage, but actually not a whole ton, really. A bit of friendly fire on Oxyotl too actually chips down his HP, but a shot on Noctilus does get him quite low. Now we have entered the late game stage here for the Lizardmen. The Cold-Blooded still on the Skink Oracle, but he routs anyways thanks to the tiny amounts of chip damage on my Sirens. And this does swing the balance of power back in my favor, although it's still quite close. I only have Noctilus, 2 units of Sirens, one of which is actually crumbling away, and some zombies. That's about it. So still a little bit worried here. Even though the Stegodons do rout, they will be back later in the battle, and Oxyotl, with his constant kiting, has actually been able to successfully avoid these Sirens quite well. He has gone fairly low on HP over the course of the battle, but it's pretty scary. Another shotgun volley on Noctilus does bring him very low too, but there shouldn't be too many shots after this. If Oxyotl does target Noctilus, the Sirens will be able to catch him, thankfully. And taking a look at the Skink Oracle, I actually have finally routed it off with my Sirens. So definitely still a very close game, but the fact that the Skink Oracle is gone is going to be a huge help for me. Stegodons are shooting in at Noctilus, though he's extremely low. I actually am out of invocations of Nahek. Stegodon charges in, but thankfully Noctilus, just a beast, survives at 40 HP, heals up to 52 with his passive healing in combat, but eventually Crumbling does take the beast himself, and Noctilus does fall before he can kill the Stegodon. pretty scary. There are only single entities left at this point, so at least I won't be getting cycle charged by the Stegodon. But the Skink Priests of Heavens and Oxyotl, they can fight off zombies at least decently well, and that's going to be a little bit bad. Plus the crumbling from the loss of Noctilus is very bad for me too, as my troops are taking consistent damage, but thankfully I do have this hero unit of Sirens coming in from the back. They've only lost 2 models the entire game, and if they can rout off the Stegodon, that would be victory for me. Bombers, they do disintegrate though. The normal deckhand mobs are on their way out too, so we'll have to see how this actually goes. Thankfully, I did have my halberds facing up against the Stegodon, so they actually did get a decent amount of damage. Nothing too crazy, but definitely enough to take a couple pixels off of its HP, getting it very close to routing, forcing a cold-blooded 2, and it breaks. Definitely a huge swing in my favor, even though the balance of power does not show it. Sirens now finally reaching the battlefield, and I have to consider my options now. I need to choose between chasing the Stegodon or fighting against Skink Priest and Oxyotl with my Sirens. The longer I chase the Stegodon, the more winds of magic will actually build up, and given the fact that this is a Skink Priest of Heavens, if he gives a wind blast, that could actually end the game if it hits all of my Sirens. So I choose instead to face off against the heroes faster. And this time I slam in a charge onto Oxyotl. A Thunderbolt does actually drop, forcing my Sirens to have to pull away from it. Saphir did tell me that in this position, he actually didn't have enough winds of magic for a wind blast. And actually, I think a bolt from the Stegodon hit the Skink Priest of Heavens, actually did a good amount of damage, causing him to rout off. So now, suddenly, with the 2 heroes routing off, the game is suddenly quite in my favor. And the Stegodon does actually shatter. Oxyotl, a second away from actually coming off the battlefield here, but he actually has 3 leadership. Now, as a skink that went up against the forces of chaos, I guess having high leadership and staying on the battle makes sense for him, but he actually does manage to buy enough time for the Skink Priests of Heavens to come back. And what that does, it brings the balance of power back to the middle again. Although I do rout off Oxyotl, and I am fairly confident that my Sirens will win the day as long as they don't eat a huge spell. I do chase off Oxyotl at this point, and I will be getting in some free hits as I continue chasing him. The Sirens just barely managing to catch up, but since Skink Priest of Heavens actually closes the gap, I decide to charge him to get my Sirens a massive 14 charge bonus on the Skink Oracle. Of course, that's not actually very important, but just being able to charge into the Skink Priest and to get him routed off, I feel like would be better than chasing off a very beat up Oxyotl. And indeed, it works out for me as both heroes finally rout off the battlefield. Sirens doing great, Oxyotl giving a final parting shot even after the battle ended. But it doesn't matter. I do manage to take the victory, and with a pretty fun and interesting Vampire Coast build. Looking at the Morin goals, they did okay. Actually quite comparable to the Sirens, but they didn't have nearly as much staying power, which is what I really want against the Lizardmen when I'm trying to rush them. Sirens are also cheaper, which is why I recommend you take them. The bombers in this case actually didn't do great, but the gunnery wights, despite getting focused down, still paid for themselves as usual. They are terrors, and being able to snipe the Skink Oracle was quite great. Skink Oracle, of course, got a lot of value too, but it actually got less value than my 2 gunnery wights. So, not the worst case scenario ever. Meanwhile, Oxyotl with a casual 3600 damage value, don't mind him, and everything else doing okay, but just barely not good enough. Definitely a very close game, and quite fun. Now, in the future, I will actually be hosting a tournament very soon, and you guys can look forward to more Vampire Coast builds like this, except against other factions. I plan to show off a build against Beastmen as soon as I'm able to use it in a tournament. So with that out of the way, remember to subscribe, and that shall be it.